Hello everybody, welcome to the Adam Smith Institute, welcome back from recess. Thank you for joining us this fine evening. I'm delighted to be hosting this panel. My name is Maxwell Marlow, I'm Director of Public Affairs at the Adam Smith Institute, and I will say I've got a very distinguished panel here to discuss something very important but not much discussed in think tank world. That is the Sanctions Framework and the future of how Britain uses its political and financial leverage around the world. I think I'll kick off in that case. Joining me, of course, is Dr. Neil Shastri-Hurst, who is the MP for Solihull West and Shirley. He's a trained barrister, as well as serving in His Majesty's Armed Forces as a surgeon. And next to him is Sir Robert Buckland, who previously served as the Lord Chancellor, as well as Secretary of State to Wales, and has served for South Swindon between 2010 and 2024. And he actually is a neighbour of ours, working the Church of England amongst dozens of other positions. I mean, I'm sat next to Britain's productivity here, which is fantastic. So we're going to discuss a paper released early this year called Financial Five Eyes Towards a New Sanctions Framework. And because Dr. Shastri-Hurst is short on time owing to the treacherous Chagos deal currently going through the House of Commons, he'll have to depart shortly to go and vote against it.
Run out like a gazelle, or slightly lame ant or something.
But you'll be back later, hopefully, as long as votes don't go on too long. So I'll actually start with you, Dr. Shastri-Hurst. How do you see Britain's sanctions framework operating in what is a torrid and quite nasty world at the moment?
Well, I think this is a real opportunity for Britain to lead on this debate, because the sanctions framework that we've been operating in is for a bygone era. We've got changing threats in terms of cyber attacks, and in my own constituency we've got Jaguar Land Rover, who have just had a seismic cyber attack, reportedly by the same group that attacked Marks and Spencer's earlier in the year. We saw how long that took to wash out. Has a huge impact on not just the local economy, but the national economy and further afield. So I think we are in a ripe spot for reforming how we approach sanctions so that they more appropriately reflect the modern world, so that they are a real opportunity for leverage, and that they can be used effectively to execute change. And I think what was really impressive about this piece of work, if I may say so, was the discussion around not just the tiered system but the ramp on and off, and knowing that it has real influence. There is no point having a stick to beat people with if there isn't a carrot that goes with it that allows approaches to be changed, and so that you can have that soft influence under a rules-based, liberal, international ordered system. And I think this sort of approach is precisely what I like to describe as thoughtful conservatism should be all about. These are sensible approaches to some of the thornier problems that are facing this country.
Fantastic. And again, because we're maybe short on time with you, do you think this Labour government, and as I said earlier, going to vote on Chagos later, do you think they take a sensible approach to sanctions? Do you think they take a sensible approach to foreign relations, things we've just removed our Foreign Secretary? What's your take on that?
In terms of the Foreign Secretary, I don't know, from the frying pan to the fire, aren't you, to a certain degree? Look, I don't think there's a huge gulf between the parties in terms of where we've sat with sanctions historically. I think there's been this compromise between parties that this is just the way it is. I think there's a real opportunity for us to reset that conversation. And in questions that I've put to ministers in my time in Parliament, and others have done the same, I think there's probably a lack of urgency around sanction reform. It certainly doesn't sit on the priorities for either the Foreign Office or the Treasury in terms of how we manipulate them to achieve the results that we want from our soft diplomatic power. And if I was looking at a government that I thought would be able to deliver these things, I'm afraid it's not the government that we currently have.
I'm worried you'd said that. But I mean, Robert, you co-authored this paper, which is very, very welcome of you. Could you give us a short background on sanctions? I'm not going to ask you to go all the way back to the Middle Ages, but I mean, what do you think is pertinent for our audience to understand what is a very complicated set of laws?
But it doesn't need to be complicated. I think if you look at the purpose of sanctions, what are they there for? Are they there to punish, or are they there to change behaviour? the main function, in fact, the primary function of sanctions is to seek to change behaviour. In other words, to encourage not just the target of the sanction, but those who trade with the target not to do so. And you can go back to 1879, and you can go back to Ireland, and you can go back to Colonel Boycott. Some of you will have heard of him, a land agent in County Mayo, who was, should we say, a little harsh with the way in which he deployed his landlord and tenant law and rent increases. He was acting on behalf, of course, he was a land agent on behalf of Lord Erne. And the Irish National Land League decided to take concerted action, and the way they did it was to encourage the local community to totally disengage with and from Colonel Boycott. In other words, to ignore him, not to deal with him, not even to speak to him. And that wasn't just about Boycott, it was about getting the entire community to adopt this approach. And it worked. Boycott left Ireland, and the policy, certainly on that estate, was changed, and the word boycotting entered the English language, and it was a very familiar word that we heard right up until the 1980s. You know, I can remember the Moscow Olympics being described, certainly Britain's refusal to participate in the Moscow Olympics in large measure was described as a boycott. And indeed, when it came to apartheid South Africa, we referred to regularly boycotting goods or boycotting activity that involved that country as it then was. It seems to have, if not fallen into complete desuetude, it's certainly not as well known and well understood as it was even 30 years ago. And it's important because from there you can trace what happens with international law and sanctions. And you do need to understand how it's grounded in what was the traditional and indeed the established way of conflict, which was the declaration of war. It's mentioned specifically in the Second Geneva Convention, and became the norm certainly at the time of the Great War, where declarations of war were traded around in those early months of 1914 because it was seen as an appropriate way in which you could identify the combatant, identify what you were doing. And of course, in those days, it wasn't a state of total war. It was all about armies and about conflicts between military forces rather than civilian population. Of course, we know that changed, and the Second World War was much more of a total war in the sense that civilian populations became involved. But still, declarations of war were the norm. The last time you see declarations of war is indeed during the Second World War. I said Germany against the United States. I think probably it's the Soviet Union against Japan might be the very last one in those dying months of 1945. But from there, you do not see the use of declarations of war. Instead, we end up with conflicts, police actions, all sorts of descriptions were used rather inventively by state actors in order to describe their behaviour. And of course, the proliferation of non-state actor conflict, which is the reality, the new reality within which we all live increasingly in the 21st century. And then after 9/11, a real sort of step change in the development of sanctions law based upon terrorist activity, a plethora of sanctions law in the US and indeed here in the UK, Proceeds of Crime Act, building on drug trafficking confiscation legislation in the 1980s, which now creates quite a draconian, but I think proportionate, series of presumptions that can allow criminal assets to be confiscated. I've used it many times as a practitioner. It's been tested even in Strasbourg, and it's found to be entirely compatible. So we have established law that has worked pretty well, but then we hit Ukraine, and we can see where the gaps lie. We can see, in fact, sadly, a combatant like Russia actually making money rather than losing money in a sanctions-based world. And it seems to me that we need to acknowledge this reality, and that there needs to be a legal framework to cover non-war conflict situations. Because at the moment, we're faced with this rather inelegant and frankly ad hoc approach, where I think naturally people are saying, well, why aren't we doing more? Not just to freeze Russian assets, but to actually confiscate them and take them away from Putin and his cronies and use them to help Ukraine. And on one level, that is a very attractive argument, and one can understand why it's being made. But let's go back to the first test, which is what is the aim of sanctions? Is it to punish or is it to change behaviour? If you jump wholesale into a confiscatory approach, you are going to the punishment mechanism. And that's not going to deter or encourage a change of behaviour from anybody. And that's why I think a more sensible approach is the one outlined in the paper, which is a rule of law based approach that does allow countries like Britain to not just freeze assets but to actually use them and to make them sweat for the benefit of either the population that will eventually have to be compensated or indeed to restore the balance. And I think that's a perfectly proportionate and sensible use of assets that exist on the streets of London. I mean, we've got lots of Libyan assets, which I've identified, which are just rotting away, which could have been, utilised, rented out, enhanced, used for the benefit, not just of the, ultimate owner, but also of those the activity that we want to encourage. And therefore, I think it's entirely compatible with, a liberal approach, a rule of law based approach, for us to create a coherent framework of sanctions law that can apply in conflict situations. And my only surprise, well, not surprise, but my only concern is, of course, we're living in an age where it does seem to be rather unfashionable to talk about rules-based international orders. We're in the era of the strong man, mainly, and the deal in the closed room. But as I say in the paper, if not now, when? It's time that we had these conversations, and frankly, a time like this demands an intellectual, coherent response to either the wishy-washy, hand-wringing, we can't do anything about it approach, which is not good enough, or the let's do the deal in the what used to be the smoke-filled room, now the air-conditioned. And I think this paper offers a way forward, and I'm so glad to be working with the Adam Smith Institute on it. I thank you for the opportunity, and I think we can build on this and make it a policy that will work.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Robert. But you identified something there, which is that we can't do anything, and often as a free market libertarian think tank, that is usually how we like our governments, is that they stepped away from things. Neil, I was wondering if you could maybe outline perhaps a free market case or a more small state case for using sanctions, which seems like a bit of a paradox, but at the end of the day, maybe it isn't.
No, it's not a paradox, is it? I mean, you can enlarge on this, Neil, because I know your time is short.
No, I agree with you. I think this is about reasserting ourselves as a rules-based democracy, which is something that, as Robert has more eloquently than I could do, highlighted, we have moved away from in this country. And we now have a situation where you're either so statist and imposing restrictions upon it from a socialist perspective, or you are so radical in a sort of Whiggish type mode that you have no control or no rules-based structure. I think this is about the state having a light touch to ensure that there is order across international borders, whilst maintaining control over the system so that it doesn't fall apart. I think that's the right level. I think that's a conservative approach to it. It's around conserving order. It's about a merits-based system, and I think it's not incompatible at all. I think it's actually within the traditions of us as a party. I think what's unfortunately happened is that there are elements that have moved away from those traditions.
Robert, would you want to build on that?
Well, look, what we're talking about here is we don't, sanctions don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in order to deal with actions that are clearly wrong, are not just morally wrong, economically damaging. Nobody's going to say that economic sabotage is somehow consistent with a pure belief in the free market. It's a perversion of the free market. It usually involves corruption. I mean, corruption isn't part of Adam Smith's view. And let's not forget, Adam Smith always talked about a free market within a series of rules. There were always boundaries. There are boundaries to it. I know a lot of you in this room will have actually read The Wealth of Nations and understand exactly what I'm talking about. But to fully understand it, of course you've got to have rules to apply in exceptional circumstances where certain criteria are met. We're not saying that somehow this should be the norm. Of course it shouldn't be the norm. But where you've got the cyber warfare that Neil talked about so well, the cyber attacks that are jeopardising legitimate businesses that are employing thousands of people and providing wealth for a nation, then that is a hostile act, and it's a criminal act that needs a response. All the type of human rights abuses are not just bad in themselves; they undermine what it is that allows the free market and freedom to operate. Without a rule of law, without a stable rule of law policed by an independent judiciary, then why would people want to invest in a country like, for example, the United Kingdom? And it just seems absolutely monstrous to me that a kleptocracy like Russia that we're talking about, which militarily punches above its weight. I mean, its economy is about the size of Spain. I mean, it's not insignificant, but its geography always gives it that sort of deceptive size and strength that it doesn't have, which is built mainly on the proceeds of corruption. And when they indulge in clearly unlawful and illegal actions by invading a neighbouring sovereign state, then do we wring our hands and say there's nothing we can do? Not a bit of it. We should be absolutely honing the resources at our disposal within the law to make them pay. But I think Neil's point about the off-ramping is a very powerful one. We do, with the stick, need the carrot. And if behaviour changes as a result of the targeted sanction, then great. It should be acknowledged, and in effect, there should be a way out. And that's why I think adhering to the original purpose of sanctions has to be where you start with developing a new policy.
Totally. I mean, speaking of backroom deals and potentially even authoritarian leaders, Donald Trump, of course. And, Neil, I know you've spoken previously about Five Eyes. Do you think there is a method to which this sanctions regime could work with the other Five Eyes nations, that being the liberal democracies, the somewhat free markets, who do all share geopolitical strategies as to keeping China in check, keeping the Middle East under control, keeping Russia in check, certainly. Do you think this could work internationally with our partners?
Well, we've seen it work very successfully from a security perspective. I think it would work equally well from an economic sanctions perspective or a broader sanctions perspective. And there is strength in numbers, and aligning with those nations that share the same vision, broad vision from a geopolitical perspective, seems a sensible way of doing it. I think you have more leverage then in terms of getting a consensus around the issue. You set it out very well in the paper. I think that is a way forward that we should be exploring. Why limit Five Eyes to just security? Why not have Five Eyes financial, etc.? It seems an eminently sensible way forward, particularly with an unpredictable White House. I think having that sense of, as I say, hunting in numbers makes a much more coherent argument to push it forward.
And NATO for sanctions.
On which note, I've got to run like a gazelle.
See you later, Neil.
See you in a bit. Robert, I mean, you intimated earlier about how sanctions can essentially, in an economic perspective, deal with negative externalities, and you highlighted in the paper stuff like environmental sanctions. Could you highlight a bit more about maybe it is doing the human rights work, maybe it is doing the environmental work, looking at those cyber attacks? I know there was a motion in the House earlier today. Things like economic sabotage. Could you give, what is the basis in law fundamentally for example, dealing with a country which behaves badly on the environment, undermines the UN's sustainability goals as well as Britain's?
Well, again, it's all about effect, isn't it? I mean, I think it's tempting to sort of try and prescribe different categories of activity. I think it's all about the effect that it has on the rest of us, and indeed on the security of the world, or the well-being of the world. And I'm not being, airy-fairy about this. I think there are clear examples, with regard to, let's say, the Chinese fishing fleets really abusing stocks in the Southeast Asia. It clearly is not just, bad in terms of sustainability of food stocks, but it's also in contravention of so many international agreements. And if they're going to mean anything, then there has to be a way in which they can, if not be directly enforced, that there is some sort of consequence for that type of action. I'm cautious here about sort of just saying there needs to be a punitive approach, because I think once you get into that area, you are starting to sort of dilute and move away from the main and I think the legitimate purpose of sanctions. But we've made changes in the past. I mean, I was delighted to be part of a government that introduced the Magnitsky sanction. I campaigned when I was a backbencher with Bill Browder on it, and Dominic Raab and I were very, very proactive as junior ministers and then as cabinet ministers to make sure that it happened. Against, can I say, the thinking of the orthodoxy within the Foreign Office, who thought that named visa bans were just a terrible thing. And they just didn't
why
like
do they think that?
Well, I think they were very worried about legal challenge. But frankly, if you don't have an appetite for risk in government, then why are you there? Was my view. I used to walk into my department and say, I have a very high appetite for risk today. And then I get these worried looks and I say, it's calculated risk, we're going to do it. And usually I was right. But and certainly in this case, we were absolutely right to do what we did. But, the next thing is using them. And yes, they have been used to quite an effective extent with regard to Ukraine, but it seems to me now that we need to develop on a broader front a more coherent approach. And it does come back, I think, to the fact that this world is now a rapidly moving one on in the cyberspace. In a matter of moments, billions of pounds of currency can be moved, security can be undermined, disinformation can cause mayhem to reputations of governments and businesses alike. Unless you have a similarly agile legal framework, then we are reduced to hand-wringing. And as you can tell from my approach, I just don't think that's good enough.
I think that's fair enough. I mean, one of the questions, you referenced it earlier about Libya and Gaddafi's portfolios. What do you do with frozen assets? Because there's kind of an understanding with the rule of law, at least in Britain, is that even if you confiscate the assets, you should really start using them, because that is banditry and theft.
Well, yes, and we do have to remember that if we with impunity just start confiscating and treating other people's property as our own, what does that do to our reputation in terms of reliability? Is owning something in this country safe? Is it safe from any government? Is our property safe? All these questions are entirely legitimate ones that need to be asked when it comes to how we behave within the sanctions space. And therefore, you're not free agents to just roam around the sanctions savannah and do what you like. You've got to constrain your actions and have a rationale for them. So here's the thing. Rather than seeing former banks and commercial premises owned by the Libyan government rotting away and gathering dust in London, why don't we, allow the sensible management of those estates so that they're brought back into use, that the funds that are raised for them are either put into escrow or indeed specifically used for the purposes of supporting, either the direct victims or those who clearly at the end of it all will stand to have some compensation or some reparation from the unlawful activities of the then Libyan government, and manage it as a good steward. I don't see any problem with that. That's entirely consistent with respecting the property rights, but it also then confers a benefit. And I think that sort of approach would be entirely within the law. I think it's arguable even now that we should be doing this, and certainly if we create a new framework of law based upon conflict, then I think it's very, very doable.
Absolutely. And what do you think, for lawyers maybe at university or training or going into practice, do you think, this is a bit of a weird question, do you think there is worthwhile thinking about these sort of wider questions, being more creative and speaking to politicians and the government, or should they keep within their own kind of tracks before they start receiving any potential backlashes?
I certainly think that politicians in politics and government could benefit by talking to some lawyers who do a lot of work in this area. We've got a lot of very talented lawyers in London. My friend who I mentioned at the end of my paper, at Latham Watkins, Tom Lane, really good thinker about these things, tempered by experience in the field, why wouldn't you want to tap into that sort of wealth of experience in order to develop policy that actually works on the ground? And here's the thing again, folk, the gap sometimes between the legislative intent of my former colleagues over in Parliament and the reality is it can be yawning. And it never ceased to amaze me that people on both sides would make very glib assertions about how particular provisions would work, and hey presto, we found out that the difference between passing a law, getting royal assent, and actually seeing it work on the ground was dramatic in many respects, bringing the law into disrepute. And therefore it does seem to me that talking to those who practice in it would be an act of basic hygiene when it comes to developing an effective policy.
And speaking as a former politician and a lawyer in practice, a barrister, of course, what sort of opposition do you see to bringing this framework in? Because I can see some political problems with it. Moving against the status quo is always very difficult. But how do you think that opposition will manifest itself, and B, what sort of arguments do you think should be made against those opponents?
Well, I think first of all, the obvious one would be there would be a sense of sort of hopelessness that unless we act in a concerted way internationally, then anything we do domestically is only going to have limited effect. Well, yes, I can understand that attitude, but as Neil said, looking at existing structures and building on them, whether it's NATO or indeed the Five Eyes, then is there potential for us to do something more imaginative here? And can Britain offer the sort of leadership that we've been, shall we say, rather good at in the past? I mean, the great thing about the Five Eyes is that is where the special relationship with the United States lives. When people ask me about whether or not there is a special relationship, I say yes, it's a security relationship, and that's what's special. Everything else is different. But if we can build on that special security partnership that we have, not just with the US, but with the other members of Five Eyes, who, let's face it, have consistently taken a very similar approach to us when it comes to dealing with the consequences of international criminality and unlawful behaviour, then I do think these things are possible. And it's our job, is it not, as policy makers and as thinkers, to get up there and say, if not now, when? I might sound like a bit like Don Quixote, but tilting at windmills has been my speciality, and sometimes it's worked.
Yeah, I hear politics is the art of the possible. Well, given Neil may not be back for a little while, and I want to open up to the floor for questions, do you have any closing remarks on this piece of work?
Well, look, first of all, it was very enjoyable, and Jasper did a very good job in working with me. I do think that we can more than hold the balance between a free and open society with civic and economic freedoms, and the need for government and state actors to, when the circumstances justify it, make the sort of interventions that on one level are draconian, but which, when viewed against a clear purpose, as the one that I've outlined to you tonight, can be demonstrated not just to preserve the interests of the nation state, but also to enhance, I think, freedom and free trade and free markets. And I think that in this paper you see that balance being struck, dare I say, elegantly, but I certainly think very, very, in a very measured way. And this picture will continue to change. It will evolve continually, and I can't pretend that any framework that we create will be good for all time. But I do think that we can do a lot better than the rather piecemeal approach that we've taken up to now, that seems to be based upon a reaction to each crisis and conflict as it comes, rather than a more coherent attempt to anticipate what might be the attacks of the future, and indeed what are increasingly the attacks of the present. So I commend it to you.